Hello and welcome. We now talk about the three major themes that'll be the kind of connecting thread or threads, if you will, through the centuries that this class covers. In some ways, we're still kind of in an introductory phase. I get this class going gradually. Last week was introduction to get our bearings on the course itself. The introductory lecture was about how we study history effectively, not anything to do specifically with world history. Here, this week, we are introductory in the sense that we're not dealing with specific events yet overall, and we're not even dealing with the textbook yet, other than the preface. And so the way that this is not an introductory facet of the class, however, is that I am going to hold you accountable as far as testing is concerned. So the materials that we cover here in this lecture, PowerPoint slides you see, will be testable material. We're going to see a lot of current historians and authors on a specific subject, and whether or not I ask you questions about the author's views and interpretations of the past, I'm not entirely sure yet. I will have a study guide on Canvas soon enough, hopefully by today or tomorrow. But you should, I think, familiarize yourself as much as you can, at least in a general sense, with the varying interpretations of the first major theme that we're going to cover here, which is the one you see, number one, why Europe and not China? One could, of course, say why Europe and not another part or other parts of the world. But most of the time, the standard comparison is between Europe as a whole and China as a gigantic empire. In the West, Europe, and the East, China and Asia accordingly. The second major theme, which certainly overlaps with theme number one, is the process of globalization, and we'll look at that in this lecture as well. And then we'll round it out with a glance at the clash of ideologies. And ideology won't loom as large in our class early on, but fairly soon, when we get a century or so in, ideology starts to become a bigger and bigger part of world history, and certainly in understanding it, which is what we're trying to do. So off we go. Why Europe and not China? What explains Europe's rise to global power from about 1500, which is where this class begins chronologically, roughly speaking? Why did Europe go through an industrial revolution first? Sometimes when asked the first question, the first two questions, why Europe and not China, some will say, well, Europe got powerful before China and the rest of the world because they went through an industrial revolution. But of course, that doesn't suffice, because then you have to ask, okay, but why did Europe go through the industrial revolution first? And so sort of we're basically stuck on the same question until we can get an answer to that. So this simple but elusive question, or questions, and it's a simple question to ask, why Europe and not China, but harder to understand, harder to answer. It's elusive in that sense, but it's central to understanding the world in the last few to several hundred years, the time period we're covering in this course. So let's meet some of the leading scholars on the question. This is where I said at the outset that you probably should at least be familiar with their work. I don't mean you have to read these books. That would be absurd, although I've read all of these, but that's my job. It's not your job. But you should be familiar with at least what they're arguing. And not all of these have slides and text, but a lot of them do. So you should be at least roughly familiar with the different types of arguments made, the different types of interpretations about, in answer to that question, why Europe and not China or not the rest of the world. Ian Morris, one of the guys on our list, who wrote a book, go back to the last slide, you can see it, why Europe, let's go back, why the West rules, I forgot the name of it, that's why I had to go back, why the West rules for now. Ian Morris, Stanford professor, historian, and archaeologist. It's a really, really good book. Hence, sort of I use it here to give us some sort of measuring stick for what's sometimes called social development in history. So what Morris has done, in part in this book, is tried to sort of look at various factors that can and would help us to explain how it was that Europe, in the time period we're covering in this class, sort of moved ahead of the rest of the world in terms of wealth and power, or as he likes to say, as a brilliant scholar, I find it quite refreshing that he tends to use terminology and phraseology that's very down to earth. It makes him very readable. So he says, social development can be thought of more simply as getting things done in the world. So which countries or parts of the world were able to get things done, mainly, again, in terms of wealth and power. So he has a social development index in the book that I just mentioned and showed you, and actually a companion book that lays out the evidence even more specifically. That one's not as interesting to read, but there's more evidence in it. But he boils it down to sort of 4 factors. So this is a way to try to be able to measure, actually quantitatively measure, sort of which countries or empires or parts of the world are ahead of others in terms of social development or getting things done in the world. And he doesn't claim that this is in any way, the be-all and end-all measuring stick. He knows it's open to question, and it could be wrong. He admits that it's incomplete. This is a huge question to answer, by the way, if you haven't figured that out. The question of why Europe and not China or other parts of the world, again, simple to ask, difficult to answer because it's a gigantic question. Right? It's kind of a very broad, general question that requires knowledge of all kinds of different subjects other than just history. So he realizes this is incomplete, but he's at least trying to get a start. Not the only person to have done this, but he's essentially trying to say, look, let's get some ways to measure this question, so we have something to quantify. So he boils it down to kind of 4 sort of measurements: energy capture, per capita food, fuel, raw materials, and such consumed. Per capita means per person in any society. Of course, these things have to be estimated, but there's been more work on these things done by historians, archaeologists, and such than you might realize. Social organization, and there are various ways you can measure that, but he boils it down to simplify things to urbanization, because there's usually always a strong relationship between the size of cities in any one country or civilization or another, and social complexity or social development. So that is to say that if you have a large city or lots of large cities in your civilization, it's probably a sign that you have a rather sophisticated social organization, or always a sign. Third is information technology, which today we think of as computers and internet, social media, but of course in earlier history it was other things. It eventually led up to computer technology and the internet. But he takes into account skill level, the skills that people had at the time and place, the speed and reach of the information technology, how quickly could you get information from point A to point B, and how far and wide could you spread it. And so that's another measuring stick, or part of the his measuring criteria. Fourth and last is war-making capacity. If a country, wars are awful things, of course, but it does say something about a people, a country, a civilization's ability to get things done, particularly like conquering other people and becoming more powerful and more wealthy. So he looks at the numbers of armies, how many soldiers could this or that country, civilization put into the field, the military technology and hardware, the weapons they used, logistics, leadership capabilities, command and control, organization, etc., etc. So energy capture, social organization, information technology, war-making capacity. All of that being said, the authors of our textbook, Professors Bentley and Ziegler, don't sort of deal with this. So I'm not saying or intending that we come back to this again and again and again. But there may be times in the class where I'll sort of come back to Ian Morris's social development measuring stick as we go through the centuries, and possibly even show you some of the charts like the one on the right, which come from his book or books, which can be explained at a later time if we need to. Exploring the Needham question. In some ways this is repetitive, but Joseph Needham was a scientist and scholar who ranged over many fields and wrote a book, or started a project, of which he wrote part of it, as you see on the right, called Science and Civilization in China. I say a project because others contributed to it after him, and now there are many, many volumes in this series. But he was fascinated by China. He was an Englishman, fascinated by China, loved China, and asked the following question, again, quite similar, if not almost the same, as the question we started with here. Why had China and India been overtaken by the West? The West means Europe and the United States by extension, in science and technology, despite their earlier successes. In one famous passage, he says, gunpowder, the magnetic compass, and paper and printing, which Francis Bacon, an English scientific thinker, considered as the foremost important inventions facilitating the West's transformation from the Dark Ages, Middle Ages, to the modern world, were invented in China. So Needham is saying, there are so many important scientific achievements and technological advances that come from China and Asia that the above question becomes increasingly more relevant and in some ways puzzling. There's two general schools of thought on why Europe, and this actually comes from Ian Morris as well, so at least at the beginning of the class here I'm relying on him fairly heavily. This doesn't exhaust the possibilities. Scholars don't write usually with an intention to fit into one kind of category or school or another, but this is in some ways a handy way to simplify the many works and books, scholarship on this subject. What Morris calls, one, long-term lock-in theories and books, and on the other hand, short-term accident books. So looking at the first and quoting Professor Morris, from time immemorial, some critical factor made East and West unalterably different and determined that the Industrial Revolution would happen in the West. Long-termers disagree fiercely amongst themselves. So even in long-term lock-in theories, they disagree about the long-term forces that locked things in, on what factor was and when it began to operate. Some emphasize material forces such as climate, topography, or natural resources. Others point to less tangible matters such as culture, politics, or religion. So long-term lock-in theories more or less mean that it was destined to happen, it was inevitable, or became virtually inevitable or inevitable at a certain point in time. So it gets locked into history, so that then those that fit into this school, and some don't fit into either school, they are tending to say that it was, in a sense, destined or overwhelmingly likely that Europe was going to go through the Industrial Revolution first and then be able to become more powerful, more wealthy than other parts of the world. At least, again, in the time period we're covering in this class. Because that wasn't true before 1500. Europe was a backwater, as we'll see. Some of these interpretations and books deal with that. Short-term accident theorists or thinkers basically say it very well could have happened in the East, Asia, China. Also, quoting from Morris again, whatever we look at, ecology or family structures, technology and industry, or finance and institutions, the standard of living or consumer tastes, the similarities between East and West vastly outnumber the differences as late as the 19th century. So short-term accident thinkers and theorists are the ones that tend to say, no, there is nothing inevitable about the West or Europe's rise to power. Much of it was just sort of luck, chance, lucky accidents, etc. We start with a very famous book written, published in 1997. All of the books we'll look at were published in roughly about a 10-year period, roughly. But Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. Diamond is not a history professor. He's a professor of science, medicine, at UCLA of all things. But he's one of those wide-ranging intellectuals who likes to take on big questions and big issues that require, dealing with and in multiple disciplines and subjects. Guns, Germs, and Steel was a smash hit, winner of the Pulitzer Prize when it came out, because he had some rather ambitious answers to the question of why Europe. I'll read first of all. A quote, "In short, Europe's colonization of Africa had nothing to do with differences between European and African peoples themselves, as white racists assume." Right? Racists, then and now, and there were far more than even scholars sometimes. By then he means like in the 19th and early 20th centuries, by the way. That used to be assumed at the height of European imperialism and colonialism, which we cover in this class as well, at least by Europeans, that the explanation for European power was European superiority, meaning intellectual superiority, and they were superior as people, biologically, etc., which is incredibly racist. So he's saying it has nothing to do with differences between one group of people and another, superiority, inferiority. Rather, he says, it was due to accidents of geography and biogeography, in particular to the continents, different areas, axes, and suites of wild plant and animal species. That is, the different historical trajectories of Africa and Europe stem ultimately from differences in real estate. So the Europeans, he claims, were just lucky to be living where they were living. The people of Africa, somewhat more unlucky, which is just a chance thing, where you ended up being born and living. So there's kind of two big issues that stand out here, or two explanations that he uses that are fascinating. They're open to argument. You should know, if you haven't already recognized this, that questions that are this big and broad, again, why Europe and not the rest of the world, is a gigantic question. And the bigger the question, the harder it is to support or prove, or make a convincing argument in favor of, and the more open to criticism it is then. So every one of these books that we're talking about here today have plenty of critics and were controversial in one way or another, because they're tackling huge questions. Huge questions require lots of evidence, and they're always open to then critique. So Diamond thinks one of the key factors in answering the question, of all things, is the number of domesticable plants and animals in your area. So in Europe, let's say, as opposed to Africa or China. And what he means by that, domesticable means, domesticated animals, animals that can be domesticated and are, like cows and sheep and goats, etc. And in Europe, just by chance, there were far more domesticable animals than there were in other parts of the world, particularly the Americas, which had very few, at least by this time, the time period we're covering in this class, and Africa, Asia, so far more domesticable plants and animals there. Domesticable plants mean those that become agricultural crops, like wheat, corn, and rice, etc. The Middle East, sort of, we now call the Middle East the Near East to historians, if you go back far enough in terms of terminology, had dozens of wild growing grains like wheat and barley and things like this that eventually spread to Europe. So by the time we catch up with these cultures and civilizations and countries, Europe has the kind of the full panoply of domesticable plants and animals and more than other parts of the world. So not all of the plants and animals were indigenous to Europe, but migration from the Middle East to southeastern Europe to the Mediterranean and then into Central and Western Europe brought some of these plants and seeds and animals with them, added to those that were already there, and it gave Europe an advantage. But how? What do domesticable plants and animals have to do with power? Right? Guns, germs, and steel. Germs, by the way, are living things, technically speaking. So microbes, plants and animals, and microbes aren't necessarily, germs aren't necessarily domesticable, but in some ways they can be in our in medical usage, etc. But the point is that the peoples in parts of the world that were lucky enough to live in places where there's a natural supply or an already existing supply of domesticable plants and animals have an advantage in moving from hunting and gathering to becoming agriculturalists, farmers. And it's when you get the ability to farm, the knowledge to farm, and have, again, the appropriate plants and animals partially because at the same time and in roughly the same way, animals are domesticated and sort of brought closer to home. So the domestication of animals and the advent of farming usually kind of go hand in hand and about the same time in particular places. But those places and peoples that have access to more domesticable plants and animals get to farming more quickly, and they also then get to urban-centered civilizations more quickly. Development of villages, towns, and cities. Hunter-gatherers, before farming and domestication of animals, they don't build permanent cities because they have to chase the food around. And there's certainly a downside to urban life, as we all know, in the modern world. But the upside to it is it allows power and wealth and technology to just kind of take off in a way that hunter-gatherer groups of people and communities cannot compete with. So the lucky place that the Europeans were living that gave them natural access. They didn't do anything, it just happened to be living, where lots of domesticable animals and plants lived, gave them a huge advantage to moving to more wealth and power through the process of urbanization and the growth of urban civilization. Also, Diamond talks about continents with east-west axes or north-south axes. What does this mean?